from the Crypt.
What is up, freaks? Welcome back to Tales from the Crypt. It's a hot Wednesday night. It's been a long day for me. I moved today by myself. It was an experience. Something I've done many times. I've said this plenty of times, but it's one of my least favorite things to do in the world, but I am pretty good at it at this point. So I was very efficient with my time. Got it done in like 5 hours. So feeling good right now, a little tired, but very, very excited for the conversation I'm about to have with my guest. For those of you out there who don't know, my guest is the artist behind SoundCloud hits, like Pretty Good Looking, The Charlatan, and Black Coffee and Meat. On top of that, he used to be the executive editor at Business Insider and is now currently an editor at Bloomberg and co-host of What Did You Miss on BloombergTV. I'd like to introduce you all to Joe Weisenthal, also known as The Stalwart on Twitter. Joe, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled.
Well, I'm thrilled.
Already a life highlight. I'm gonna add that, you sort of like went through my biography there, but this is now I'm going to add that. I'm not even being facetious.
No, I mean, fanboying now a little bit. Been a FinTwit fan of yours for years now.
Thank you.
Going back to my days when I worked in finance in like 2011, 2012. I think I started following you on Twitter back then.
Thank you.
Watching you grow from Business Insider to now Bloomberg has been a fun experience.
Yeah, it's been a pretty wild ride, and it's kind of fun thinking about how we're thinking about how we're basically 10 years removed right now from the financial crisis. And I remember like those were some of my first days tweeting. Like I remember Twitter on the day when Bear Stearns collapsed and JP Morgan announced it was going to buy it for $2 a share. And I'm like, damn, 10 years just sitting here firing off tweets.
Right?
Yeah, it's been fun sort of building, meeting people this way. And I met you through Twitter and sort of watching this community grow. And of course, seeing FinTwit kind of morph with crypto Twitter has been pretty wild. Mm-hmm. And it's been a fun constant along with the various more official career activities.
It's my favorite way to consume news.
Yeah, I was thinking about the other day, Twitter, the company, has always kind of struggled a little bit. They've never made a ton, they've never really consistently thrived as a business. The stock goes up and down. And so many people on Twitter profess to find it miserable. And yet, I kind of feel like it's actually the only social network that I have never even come close to reducing my usage of. Like, I used to use Facebook more. Now I find myself hardly ever posting there. Instagram, I post there and stuff like that. But in the end, like, Twitter is just a constant. And I don't see it changing anytime soon.
It's like the hive mind. It's like you're just plugged into the pulse of the world.
Yeah, it's really wild.
That's what's like. I found it like most wild during like war, like when things in Syria were heating up in like 2012, 2013. You could like go follow Syrians on the ground and see exactly what was happening.
I remember very vividly that in the early days of the Arab Spring. Mm-hmm. People in Egypt, people in Tahrir Square, incredible imagery, and you just sort of realize that all of their media during those things was just delayed and behind.
Exactly, and it's I think it's changing us. Twitter changes the people that use it. I don't know if it's in a good way or a bad way. I don't know either.
Yes.
I have an addiction. It's bad.
Yeah.
My wife yells at me a lot.
Same.
But I'm happy that you brought up this sort of molding of crypto Twitter and finance Twitter, because that reminds me of your talk at the Coin Center Gala.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, you originally started out as a Bitcoin skeptic on November 6th, 2013. You wrote an article on Business Insider while you were there. Bitcoin is a joke. And you said, Bitcoin? Nada. It's nothing. There's nothing keeping it being a thing. If people lose faith in it, it's over. Bitcoin is fiat currency in the most literal sense of the word.
I kind of actually stand by that part in the sense that if people do lose faith in it, it is over. There is nothing backing it up.
I would agree. This is, by the way, this is the tidbit that Pierre Rochard and Michael Goldstein posted on their Bitcoin skeptics list. So
I'm still on the list of Bitcoin skeptics. Pierre told me he was considering that I might be the first person ever removed from the list, but I guess I still.
I don't know if you
haven't
should
been
be removed or should just be an asterisk.
Maybe an asterisk.
Is now somewhat of a skeptic.
Yeah, just a moderate skeptic. Well, I think there were I think back to like when, in fairness, a lot of people were skeptics and very vociferous about it in the beginning. It's hard to wrap your head around. Mm-hmm. It's hard to wrap your head around why what is essentially a big distributed spreadsheet that everyone mm-hmm. and this is your cell and you have, or this cell has your name in it, should be worth value. And it's one thing to sort of say, well, it's this global computer but there's not really that much you could do with it. There mm-hmm. never really has been. It's just the belief that the cell in the spreadsheet is of value fundamentally. And it's pretty hard to wrap your head around. And I sort of saw in Bitcoin people and in the ideology essentially a rehash of gold bug argument that I didn't find to be particularly compelling. Mm-hmm. A lot of warning about, there's the fixed supply of them. We're going to collapse and do hyperinflation, which hasn't happened. And I sort of did. It sort of seemed like a classic bubble. In this, mm-hmm. and obviously, if you were to look at a chart of Bitcoin going back to the early days, you can't even see that bubble because it's such a tiny blip. And who knows where we're at now? But at the time, it seemed like, okay, this is Beanie Babies or Pogs or gold or whatever, mm-hmm. and people from time to time get this fascination with things. But because there's no inherent reason that the value would be anchored other than the belief, I essentially figured that for a while there'd be people into it, and then the belief would mean that eventually it would have to disappear. And I think we'd have to admit, like, it maybe one day could. There's Definitely. Nothing guaranteeing that it always will.
No.
But over time I've come to be less skeptical of some of the argument or Bitcoin itself, in part because I've sort of reconstructed arguments that I've made in my head. They're sort of different than the sort of arguments that I didn't find very compelling.
Mm-hmm. And so how did you reformulate these arguments?
Well, so for example, I started realizing that some of my more economics-minded arguments against Bitcoin, I started noticing holes in my own arguments that mm-hmm. made me a little bit uncomfortable. So, for example, it's been noted that it's not, if Bitcoin is rising, and for most of Bitcoin's history it is rising, apart from a few periods of crashing, that it is inherently deflationary, and so that encourages hoarding, and that is in theory not very good for a currency. But then I realized that in my mind, the mistake that I was making was I was assuming that prices of goods would be sticky in Bitcoin. So in other mm-hmm. words, you might sell a bicycle for $1,000 in $1,000 US, and maybe back then you might have sold it for $1 Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. But if Bitcoin jumps in value to $2,000, then you can easily change the price to half a Bitcoin. And so I started realizing that this idea that it was that the currency inherently discouraged spending was not really accurate, because it's just as easy to take down the notional Bitcoin price. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the point is, I just started realizing like some of these assumptions that I had about Bitcoin, they weren't quite working out in my head. Like I didn't feel comfortable with them. And then I also had the thought that, so I started revisiting some of my basic assumptions. And then I started thinking about actual use cases. And one of the most obvious use cases to me was the idea of circumventing capital controls. Mm-hmm. So you think about, say, someone in China, and they want to get their money out of the country. There's limitations. We know there's various things that they can do currently. So, for example, they could buy Rolex watches or something like that, and then take them out of the country. they could take a trip to Macau and gamble and accumulate chips and then cash those chips in for US dollars outside the border. They can try to buy real estate in Australia or Vancouver or something. And then you start to realize, okay, well, this is another way of solving the problem. There actually is use here. And so someone might want to transfer several $million worth of money from inside China to outside China, and something like Bitcoin could just be a bridge for it. So maybe they're not interested in just holding Bitcoin per se, but for a temporary transaction, turn RMB into Bitcoin, send Bitcoin to someone outside of China, have that person sell Bitcoin for US dollars. It's actually a very elegant solution. So it was things like that that started making me uncomfortable with my previous analysis. One thing about that example, and of course I'm sure as you know, as you understand, people are always talking about the fees of Bitcoin. It's like, oh, it's expensive, it's slow, and that's true. But think about the fees of flying to Macau and having to stay in a hotel room, or think about the fees of, slowly moving money out of the country and buying a piece of property in Australia. So actually, if you think of, if you're going to buy a cup of coffee, the fees are prohibitive.
Exactly.
But if you're actually going to use it in a way that sort of makes sense for what the technology can do, then the fees don't seem very high at all.
Yeah, it seemed negligible to a sense.
Right, exactly.
And that's probably and we talked about narratives with Nick Carter on the last podcast, and probably the narrative I believe most is that Bitcoin will become a settlement layer at the end of the day for large purchases or even transfers of wealth between banks in the future and stuff like that. And then
Nick had a really good post recently about the history. I mean, exactly that, the various narratives and the sort of digital gold narrative and this idea, censorship resistance. So and I find that very compelling. Gold, of course, has never, at least in the modern era, has never been something that people really spend very much. And it would be pretty cumbersome to spend gold. But that doesn't mean that it still obviously has value. A lot of people like to hold it. It theoretically protects you against some sort of hyperinflation scenario. And so even if it's not a good spending currency, it might still have value for me. And I think that's more or less the case with Bitcoin.
Yeah. Would you prefer to hold Bitcoin or gold?
Well,
put you on the spot.
I think I would say this. Here's the difference between Bitcoin and gold. I think I've thought about this idea of safe haven assets and what characterizes a safe haven. And to really understand that, I think you have to think about what is the tail risk that you're protecting against. So gold, I think, is a theoretical protection against the collapse of fiat currency. Farmland has similar properties, but I think that might be protection against some sort of societal destruction. So maybe if you think there's going to be a war or something like that, or you just want to get out of Dodge, then you go to a working farm. So land has similar qualities, but it's a different risk than with gold. And I think with Bitcoin, the primary thing the tail risk that you are really protecting against is not hyperinflation per se, is not some sort of period of violence, but really about some sort of constriction on your ability to transact. So that's the importance of the censorship resistance aspect of it. That ultimately, if you fear for whatever reason, and people in different societies may have very much to fear, and some people maybe in the US probably don't have a lot to fear, but different people fear that they may not be able to sell a good, or they may, whatever it is, some sort of, being able to sell something is kind of like a form of expression at times. Then I think Bitcoin is sort of a protection against that.
Yeah, a protection against something like that happened in India last year when they just say, hey, these denomination of notes just don't work anymore.
Right, exactly. You could just have a situation where you're not allowed to spend that. And so if you want to protect against something like that, in theory, I think that is where Bitcoin comes in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I do think this is really important. And again, it's why I never found the sort of recycled gold bug arguments, the anti-Fed arguments, to be all that compelling when it came to Bitcoin, because I've never really bought the idea of, and we can get into it later, of currency collapse and hyperinflation outside of extreme cases. Mm-hmm. And so I'm still pretty skeptical about gold, but I think with a different set of risks and a different set of tail risks, that a different type of safe haven asset might make sense.
Yeah. So what are you still skeptical about Bitcoin? Like, you're less skeptical. What are you most skeptical about when it comes to, is it the tech side? Again, the scenarios in which it would become successful, or just maybe even like user adoption barrier to entry too. Like,
I think the user adoption thing is still really massive. Mm-hmm. And I think, so I kind of think there's two issues. One is the tools to get it and to store it are still completely, I think, unrealistic for most people. The ease with which people can be hacked or stolen, very serious problem. I think there's all kinds of issues with that. And then I think that in general, there's a lot of companies that are sort of dipping their toe into the water in some way that might make it more user-friendly, financial institutions. But what I think is that if it really ever takes off, that we would see a pretty big regulatory response, and that most of the companies who are sort of engaged in transacting it or engaged in converting it to fiat for people could easily be shut down or just back off. Yeah. And they say, we don't want to be involved in this. So if it were to really grow, and if it were to become a major vehicle for censorship-free transactions, and there's no doubt that a big category of those would be black market transactions, the type the government doesn't want to see, online drug dealing, things like that. Bitcoin is clearly good for that. I'm not going to say that it's
not perfect.
It's not perfect.
You can trace it.
Right.
You can trace Bitcoin particularly. Monero and Zcash are probably more suitable for dark.
Although there are efforts to make Bitcoin more fungible.
Yeah.
And more anonymous.
But it's not a given yet.
Sure.
No,
that's true.
Yeah.
But I think that, if spending in this way were to flourish, you could easily just say, you know what? It's very easy for me to imagine banks saying, or the government saying, banks, no, you can't do business with Bitcoin exchanges anymore.
Is there a threshold at which, like, Bitcoin's around, like, it's almost a decade old at this point? Like, say this doesn't happen for like another 5 years. Is there a point where it's like, hey, how the hell did you let this happen for 15 years? And
I've wondered about that, whether there could be a day in which governments, because I think if you look at government, I'm kind of like a blockchain skeptic, as I know a lot of like Bitcoin people are. Like, I'm pretty skeptical that like blockchain technology, excluding coins or whatever, is going to be a real important technology on its own for corporations or whatever. But you do have this attitude, I think, that among regulators and among who are kind of like, well, we don't want to stymie innovation, and we're nervous about this, but we don't want to shut it down, whatever. And part of that may be them thinking that this technology is going to be really important in some way. And it seems totally plausible to me that maybe like 5 or 10 years or 2 years or 6 months down the road, people are going to be like, this technology really does not contribute much to the existing financial system as we know it. And we just think it's dangerous that people can transact in a way that we can't easily track, and banks don't do business with the exchanges. And I don't think that would like kill Bitcoin per se, but it would be a serious blow. I mean, there's no question about that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, because as every day goes by that they don't do it, again, the Lindy effect comes into play. But then you also have this interesting game theory play as well, where like the emerging markets at the bottom of the barrel, like the Venezuelas, the Zimbabwe's, the Argentinas, Iran's, blah, 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 that literally have nothing to lose. And if they were to sort of adopt this do you think like the U.S. and the West would let them like take over this technology and run it? And that's like I don't know.
I think it's most likely. I think the opposite, and we've kind of seen the opposite, in which the more authoritarian the country, the less open they are the less encouraging they are of the people using it.
Oh, well, recently, Maduro has been telling people to mine cryptocurrency.
Has he?
He had.
Wow.
I met with Santiago Siri last week. He's Argentinian, but he's got his ear to the ground in Venezuela. And apparently Maduro gave a speech recently where he was like, our currency's such shit. Like he literally couldn't say anything worse. It was like, mine crypto. But with that being said, he was telling them to mine Petro, which is their
right. Oh, he was telling them to mine Petro.
But you can't mine Petro. It's all mined already. So like he doesn't even know what he's saying. But he's
that's right.
Like he's.
But like I mean, we have seen. I mean, it really obviously Bitcoin really took off in China for a while, and they've really cracked down pretty hard.
Well, the new China FUD is the ETF approval FUD.
Right. And so there's always something, but the China turned out to be real, right? I mean, in the end, like all those huge exchanges are like not really a thing anymore.
Yeah,
and there's much less mining in China.
Yeah, all the miners got spooked, moved outside the borders. Bitmain's actually buying a bunch of like land in Texas right now.
So China had a real reason to be anti-Bitcoin because again, capital controls and then they like acted on it. So if it got to the point where I think the U.S. government started saying, "Oh, this is becoming a source of tax evasion. This is becoming a meaningful, meaningful black market activity," it's totally plausible to me that they're like, banks just don't do it anymore.
I guess this is my follow-up question. Do you agree with that mindset from like the government? Like, do you think Bitcoin is a utility that should be a public utility?
Do I agree with it? That's a good question. I guess what I would say is it doesn't really matter whether I agree with it or not. I just think this is how governments are not going to be particularly inclined towards a meaningful amount of economic activity that doesn't pass through official entities. That I could send something to you or you could send something to me, and there would just be no easy way to know about it or stop it. And so I don't know. Like, I mean, I think governments are legitimate, and I think laws are legitimate, and I think taxes are legitimate. But ultimately, I think A, governments are probably going to do what they'll do, and B, I don't think that they could ever really kill Bitcoin, but they could really crush the liquidity to a point where its utility is diminished or it takes a very long time to build that back up. It is, I mean, you could imagine a world in which Bitcoin transactions are all done like in a back alley, paper wallets for
you do open dimes.
Cash. Yeah, right. And so that's why I don't think that like even it would kill Bitcoin completely if that ever happened. But one would have to admit that would crush a lot of the speculative money that's coming into Bitcoin. The people who are just sort of put $1,000 in a Coinbase account, like it would sting.
Yeah, no, it'd be terrible. But like,
but on the other hand, there is this sort of obvious anarchist streak in Bitcoin. I mean, that's a big part of the sort of ethos, and so I almost think that from like the hardcore Bitcoin perspective, it would be almost disappointing if the government didn't fight back, because that would mean that there was what was the point of it?
That's exactly what I was about to say. Like being a degen Bitcoiner, like people are already mentally preparing for this. Like the governments are coming. Like, what are we going to do then? And it's like that people are starting to talk now. Like we should stop fighting with shitcoiners and all band together because we're going to have to fight governments like in the next 5 to 10 years.
Right. Like to some extent, if it doesn't threaten regulators, then what is the point of it all?
Exactly. Go big or go home.
Yeah.
But the thing that drives, like, and I completely agree with you, like this is coming, mentally preparing for it. But like, I do think it's an inevitability in a sense. Like people have been like Sovereign Individual is like the biggest like Bitcoin nerd book out there.
Yeah.
Written by Reese Davidson and Lees-Moggs, right?
It's like there's like that current politician in the UK, Rees-Mogg. It's like his dad or something.
Yeah,
wrote the book.
something like that. But they wrote it in 1997, literally word for word. There will be a future in which there is a currency separate of governments and central banks that's secured by cryptography and peer-to-peer. So, and that's like sort of the crypto anarchist manifesto too. Is like this revolution started 40 years ago when cryptography became a thing, and it's like everything is going to eventually build. And that's another big theme on this podcast, is that we're born at an inflection point. We literally just, from a human species at a chemistry level, don't know how to react to the pace of change that's happening in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I think that there's no separating the rise of Bitcoin from just the political developments, the changing culture in terms of how people think about each other and how people think about the relationships that we've seen from the rise of the internet and social media. Like, it's all part of it.
Yeah. No, it's crazy how Bitcoin in particular, the community in Bitcoin, like, has shown the value of these internet relationships. Like, I went to a steak dinner in Dallas and met people I've been speaking to online for years.
Yeah.
For the first time, and it was like we were brothers. Like, we knew each other. It was crazy. It was like the first time I ever like brought my like nerd internet self like into Meet Space to meet these people, and it was just like, the internet is a weird thing. The internet, how it connects us.
That is a safe thing to say, that the internet is a weird thing.
But yeah, like, let's piggyback on Bitcoin and the space in general. You talked about like private blockchains and all, but what do you think about like Ethereum, ICOs?
So I operate from the premise that if you're going to do something for me, so if you're going to give me a good, if you're going to perform something on your computer for me, some calculation, if you're going to store data for me, whatever it is, and you want to get paid in money, right? Like, I know that seems really obvious, but I think this is really important to operate from like a basic principle.
Yes.
That anything, now people occasionally do things voluntarily, but let's just talk about actual commerce. You want to get paid in something of value, right? So there's all these like people talking about like, are cryptocurrency, should they be stores of value, mediums of exchange, blah, blah. I hate, the whole debate is kind of weird. Of course something has to be a store of value first. Someone has to want to like hold the thing and say this is worth holding.
Right.
Like then you can like build on top of that, or then say like, okay, but it's impossible to spend this. But the first thing that has to happen is you have to think it's a thing. So for example, like going back to circumventing capital controls out of China, which I think is sort of continues to be what I think is a classic potential use case, and maybe actual use case. You couldn't do it with napkins. In other words, you couldn't say, okay, I'm going to convert these RMB into napkins, and you're going to take these napkins to Australia, and then someone's going to give you a bunch of money for them, right?
Yeah, not unless they were loaded with peyote or something.
Right. Like, you couldn't, right, exactly. But you could say, but why not? I mean, like, why can't, they're actually, napkins are really good because no one would think to inspect your bag for them. They wouldn't set off any dogs. If someone did open your bag and they saw a bunch of napkins, they probably wouldn't care. They might think you're weird, but they wouldn't care. They are fungible, so like no one knows the history of it. Like, napkins have a lot of characteristics of a good medium of exchange, if you think about it, right? But the whole edifice of that idea is obviously nonsense on stilts. It collapses because no one thinks like a suitcase full of napkins are valuable. No one thinks they're money, right? So if you jump ahead of the money question, then you can't jump ahead of the money question. And all cryptocurrencies, so they're basically all about paying someone to do something. So you have Ethereum, and then you have a bunch of Ethereum competitors, which are about paying a network of computers to run calculations for, say, some distributed application, to run a database for your token, whatever it is. But in order to establish that those computers are getting something of value, you have to establish that it's money. That's the basic thing. And I don't know that any other currency besides Bitcoin has yet achieved that, or is really on pace to achieve that. And I think, to me, that's what I would want to see. And you look at that's still the hurdle that I don't think any other crypto has achieved. And I don't even know if Bitcoin has achieved it actually, but I think it's the closest.
It's the closest, and I think, wow, we're on the same wavelength here, Joe. I love that you just said that because I completely agree. Like people, so my biggest knock on the space, not obviously, but you probably don't listen to this podcast, so I talk about this a lot. Like people are so fucking impatient in this space, like, and they don't realize that for money to become money, it takes time. It's psychological. Like,
yeah, it's really hard to create money.
Exactly.
This was, and you mentioned the keynote that I gave at the. Can we talk about that?
Yeah.
So I mentioned the keynote that I gave at the Coin Center dinner, and it was basically about like what is money and how does crypto fit into it, and it's really hard to create the conditions for when a new money can exist. But I do think that if you look at money, and we could debate what money is forever and never come at an answer, but there is one characteristic that is pretty consistent, and there does seem to be a sort of mythological, mystical, spiritual element to most money. And so even if you look at a dollar bill, the dollar bill is supported by a lot of things, the requirement to pay taxes in it, the fact that whatever, the military, but there's like all kinds of weird iconography on it. They want you to think there's like something of value there that is like deep and profound, and only Bitcoin basically has the great origin story.
Exactly.
And I think it's funny because Bitcoiners are often accused of like, this is a religion. And I kind of think it's like, yeah, definitely.
Exactly.
Because obviously then there's not only the origin story, there's the evangelism of people going out, getting fights. There's the diet of
the carnivore diet.
Yeah, as you mentioned, your steak dinner. And like, it makes total sense. Like, it's weird and people are like, crypto carnivory, but you see it's like, yeah, religions have a diet.
It's proliferating too.
Yeah.
I see more and more people. I'm not a carnivore, just so you guys know. I'm an omnivore. Actually on a no carb, no sugar diet right now. Liquid doesn't count. I'm allowed to drink alcohol. But no, it is crazy how it is somewhat religious, like the Genesis block.
The white paper. I mean, it's literally it's like the Gideon's Bible, and people leave them places.
People do.
Yeah.
The Queen Center just hands them out wherever.
Yeah. They literally look like little religious pamphlets that a crazy person on the street would give you.
You know what? Maybe that's the next big push we should. This is a side note for Bitcoiners listening right now. We should push to get the white paper, the Queen Center version of the white paper in every hotel room in America.
I think one of the points that I made in the Coin Center dinner was the spiritual origins of gold, which maybe people don't appreciate, but the ancient Greeks.
Yeah, we talked about this the first time we met.
Yeah, so the ancient Greeks noticed that gold was the only metal that never tarnished. And so they thought that it had divine properties, which is really interesting because you start to think, gold has a lot of good qualities to be money, but that is one. So they thought, this must be the money of the gods because it's the only thing that is not human. It doesn't die. Gold is just gold forever. So
yeah, and it's
even gold has those properties.
Yeah, and that's again like the big theme, like patience. Like this stuff is going to take time, and that's where I've come to. Like I haven't said this in a while, but I found my Bitcoin Zen like middle last year, a couple years ago, where it's just like it either happens or it doesn't. I believe it will happen, but there's going to be a bunch of noise in between, and it's literally just trying to stay true to your convictions and knowing exactly what you like. That's what I think Bitcoin maximalists have in our favor as well, is that we've been very straightforward with our ideals and what we believe this will become for years, where everything else has more of a shifting narrative. I
think this also really speaks to the flaws with the sort of Silicon Valley VC sort of like crypto narrative, because the framework that like Silicon Valley types have is like iterate, try new things, break things, whatever. That doesn't work with money.
No.
Like that, it doesn't actually make any sense. And in fact,
have you ever heard of a bank run? Like
right. And in fact, it's more impressive when something doesn't change. I mean, what's impressive about Bitcoin is how little it's changed. And so people will look at it as like, oh, well, Ethereum is smart contracts and this has this, and everything is like Bitcoin plus. But from my perspective, it's like actually the impressive thing is that there's been virtually no change to Bitcoin since day one. It kind of emerged as a complete project. That's another thing. So you think about like Ethereum, like it has all this promise, right, for smart contracts platform, distributed apps, whatever. It can't really do any of them yet.
No.
Because it doesn't scale and they're still working on that. Okay, they might solve that, maybe not. Like Bitcoin, it's already a complete thing. I mean, like even if the Lightning Network were to never take off, and so let's say even like micropayments, you just couldn't do it, it still does its job.
Exactly.
It's in theory.
In theory.
Yeah.
It creates censorship-resistant peer-to-peer. It enables censorship-resistant peer-to-peer transactions every roughly 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's all it needs to do. That's
Right.
what like blows my mind is that people don't realize that. Like that's
It doesn't need to do, like there may be more it can do, and maybe there will be distributed apps one day. Because the idea of like a distributed apps is not inherently, there are appealing aspects of it.
You don't need a blockchain for a distributed app though. Like the Silk Road was a distributed app. Like
Right.
you Tor and
Right. There,
like,
that's the right. There, it already exists. Things that we already have other forms of censorship.
Mastodon, the new
right.
Twitter competitor. Which
Have you used that?
I have. It's
I haven't.
I've been dabbling with it the last week in particular. It's fun.
Is anyone using it?
Some people, like hardcore Bitcoiners, are. Like,
Maybe I'll check it out.
they're not happy with the censorship. BitcoinHackers.org
Okay, I'll check it
is
out.
the Mastodon instance for Bitcoiners. No, but it's like these, like, it's like every. So actually, this is perfect that we're falling into this conversation now. I brought up a tweet by our good friend Arbed Out.
Yeah.
The
the best person on Twitter.
best person on
One
Twitter.
of the
Easily.
certainly the best person on crypto Twitter.
The most signal to noise, like the highest
Yeah.
signal to noise ratio in
Yeah.
the world, I would argue. But he likes to draw analogies to past bubbles and past manias, specifically .com and the railroad mania, the early 20th century. And he brought up somebody like Sun Microsystems, which is like a very legit company. Like the CEO Scott McNally, like during like looking back in retrospect on the .com days, bubble days, was like, do you realize how ridiculous these basic assumptions are? You don't need any transparency. You don't need any footnotes.
Right.
What were you thinking? And he was talking about like his own company, like was valued at something where their revenues, the amount of people they had like understaffed, like would never be able to catch up to that valuation. And it probably took them a decade.
Arbed Out had another great tweet recently talking about what capitulation looks like, because obviously with the recent crash, people's like, oh, is this the bottom? Is this the bottom? And it's like the bottom is going to be like when someone on Bloomberg TV is too embarrassed to like go on a crypto podcast. I was like, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with that. Well, like that'll be the real bottom when everyone is just completely ashamed to be associated with anything like that. So if you think like a 20% decline or an even 80% decline is like a bottom, like that's not what the end of a bubble
We're talking
looks
complete
like.
demoralization.
Complete demoralization is like, what? Oh, I never spoke at the Coin Center dinner. No, like what? That must have been someone who looks like me. That'll be me in like a year or whatever. I'll just deny that ever happened.
No, it wasn't me. I actually had a stunt double going
Yeah, stunt
around.
double. There's someone else with my
I was
name.
A/B testing myself.
Yeah, exactly. That's how you'll know. That's when the bottom will be reached. Not just this. I mean, yeah, not that.
Well, so that's the other big debate that goes on with like Bitcoiners, like at least that I have conversations with, is like how many more of these pump and dump cycles will we have, especially with like the altcoin scene.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing, I would argue, what we're seeing in the last 18 months with ICOs is a repetition of what we saw with like pre-mined altcoins in 2013, just rebranded in a certain way.
Right.
But again, the education barrier and the lack of education globally with what this stuff is, like obviously dumb money's a thing, and people can spin up new narratives around different types of cryptocurrencies in the future. And it's like, what is... I mean, I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this, but I'm just like, speaking out loud. Like, how many more of these cycles do we have before people are like, all right, this is
It doesn't feel like they're going to end. Like, it feels like I was just looking at the top coins from 2013, and most of them are like completely dead.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like people will ever stop trying to be the next Bitcoin, or every time there's going to be an upsurge, it'll be a new thing we're not thinking about right now. So most of those ones, I think, in 2013 were essentially like Bitcoin clones, right?
Yeah.
And as you mentioned,
Litecoins,
yeah,
faster block
Fearcoin
times,
and Feathercoin and whatever, and then there's like the things. This time it's like these platforms, these smart contract platforms and ICOs. There's always going to be like something new because it's unavoidable. It's one of there was a really interesting paper came out a couple of years ago. I actually had one of the authors of it on my podcast about how to actually identify bubbles. Because it's harder than it looks, but one of the characteristics of bubbles is a proliferation of new securities that are essentially, and that's really, there was a few things. So one is obviously rapid price increase. Another one I think was like people quitting their jobs and going into that space. So check that box. And there's also like the proliferation of exactly of new securities and just the replicate. And it's really the supply that swamps. I was thinking about this. Something I was thinking about the other day. It's always a fool's errand to say like, oh, what pricked the bubble? Like, what was it? Because in the end, like, it's a meaningless question because a million tiny things could prick a bubble. It's just about. But I was thinking a pretty significant development late 2017 that I think was the clear one beginning of the end was Coinbase's putting Bitcoin Cash on their platform.
Oh my gosh!
And I
think I think it was like 2 days before. It was Festivus. I think they did it. They did it on Festivus.
But what I think. It was all going to crash anyway because everything was getting completely insane by December and then certainly January. But I think that was actually really symbolic because it was a very clear signal that there is no shortage of crypto. So like Bitcoin, there's only ever going to be 21 million. But there's certainly no shortage of cryptocurrencies or coins in general in the abstract that someone could put money into. And eventually this huge wall of money starts to run into a wall of supply. And so that I always thought that was like, okay, that was a kind of signal that everyone knew all this money was like rushing into the space. It was like institutional money is coming in the ETF. But we also saw the supply increasing to match the demand. And I think that was a sort of pivotal moment.
Yeah, that's actually.
Because then it's like, what do you have? Like, we're Litecoin Cash, whatever. You just start to sort of the opportunities then become endless.
Yeah, you can like just go full Bryce Wiener, spin up shitcoins, whatever.
But I also think again, this gets to the Silicon Valley sort of Ethereum mindset, which is that it's good for there to be a lot of coins because it's a race for who can build the best platform. And if you think about it like a startup. If you think about it like a social network, then it's like, sure, it's like, okay, Snapchat adds stories, then Instagram adds stories, then this. It's like, oh, where is your story strategy? And if you think about it from like the startup lens, then of course that makes total sense to say like, yeah, let 1 million coins bloom and we'll see which one is the best. But I don't really think that's a very useful frame for looking at currencies.
No, not at all. Because what these people don't realize is and I'm not saying this out of fear of competition or anything, but I'm saying this just out of psychology. If any of these coins were to overtake Bitcoin, like what is to stop anything from overtaking them in the future? And you have like a never ending, there's always going to be something shinier.
Well, yeah, and I think this was, I remember when, the sort of early 2018, I think it was late 2017, and people were really wondering whether like Bitcoin Cash would overtake Bitcoin. And also there was that fear that if enough hash power went over to Bitcoin Cash, that Bitcoin would be vulnerable to an attack. That Bitcoin would be vulnerable to some kind of attack, which is maybe true. Maybe one day that'll happen. But if that were to happen, then you would have to wonder about like the entire edifice of anything, because if Bitcoin were to go down, and again it might, then how could anyone ever again say, well, this is secure and censorship resistant?
Exactly.
And so there is this irony that if they're all in competition and Bitcoin can lose, then you can never then again say about any currency, this will be the new enduring store of value.
Exactly.
So I think your point is spot on.
And a lot of people don't realize that. And then But then the people that do realize that start to say like, oh, Bitcoin and Ethereum aren't in competition. But I would argue they are, because with the way blockchains work at like under the hood level, like the only application they're good for is money, I would argue.
My theory, and I know we're recording this in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, but my theory is that like Bitcoin is for meat eaters and Ethereum is for people who live in Williamsburg. And it's basically
That's
like
true.
Like Ethereum is basically the Bitcoin of Brooklyn.
We're in the same building as CoinFund.io.
Right.
Like
And so basically this actually gets back to like the sort of culture. I mean, I am really interested in the sort of what's the word? Anthropology of the different coin people, but I do find it interesting that like the Bitcoin people are like all eat steak, and Vitalik eats like avocados and fish and stuff like that, which is fine. But it is interesting. It doesn't seem like an accident that he has
Exactly.
and he's tweeted about that and about like what he prefers to eat, and it's like it's a different thing. It's like it's a different scene.
No, but it is crazy how these types trend towards each other. But there are outliers. We got. Sorry if there's background noise, freaks. There's somebody cleaning something in this office or somewhere. I don't know where. Hopefully it's done soon. But it is interesting seeing people like trend towards like the different coin factions trend towards certain lifestyles. But I will say there are outliers. It might be a little confirmation bias. Like Matt Corallo, who is, I'm pretty sure he's like number 3 and ever commits to the Bitcoin core repository, is a vegan. And
and Elizabeth Stark of Lightning, who's one of the coolest people in all of Bitcoin.
I'm trying to get her on here.
Oh, really?
She's so busy. She's so busy.
She's so cool. But I think she's also a vegan. So
yeah, you had a great interview with her.
Yeah, that was. She came on my show on TV, and that was like one of our most watched clips ever.
Was it?
So, yeah. I think people like, I think so much especially last year, so much of like Bitcoin and crypto coverage has just been about like price. And it's like, is the price going to go up? How, whatever. And we just had a conversation like talking about the Lightning Network and the inherent challenges of scaling any blockchain. And so I think people appreciated like a more technical conversation.
Yeah, and that's a shameless plug for Marty's bend here. We'll never talk about price. We just talk about ideas.
That's a good commitment.
I mean, there will be one-off instances like during the crazy run of last year. It's like, holy shit! Like I can't believe it's at $10,000. But try to focus on ideas. Like price, people get distracted by price, but I think Bitcoin's success depends on people actually thinking about how to scale it and thinking about the technical aspect of it. This has been a great conversation so far. How far are we at?
Having a blast.
45 minutes in. You sure you don't want any whiskey?
I'm good.
Joe has withheld the whiskey. I'm drinking alone like a degenerate right now.
I need to sound coherent.
So let's jump into economics. So curious, just don't know.
Yeah.
Were you a journalism major or a economics major? Finance?
I was neither.
Philosophy?
I was a political science. I used to be really interested in politics. I was a political science major. Actually, at the University of Texas at Austin, where I went, they called it government, but it's political science.
You went to UT?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was always interested in markets. I think because I was in high school and I started becoming aware of them during the .com bubble, and so it just became a fascination. And I traded stocks in college a little bit and made and lost a lot of money. So it was always just an interest of mine, but I never knew like that I wanted to like do anything with it. And again, economics and markets had always sort of been interested in the economy and economic theory and stuff like that. But I sort of stumbled into covering it. It wasn't, in 2004, I moved to New York and I worked for a small portfolio management company doing research. That job ended because the company moved out and I didn't have a job or anything. And I was like, well, in the meantime, while I look for a job, I'll start a blog covering markets because it'll at least keep me fresh and allow me to write and force me to keep paying attention. And I didn't really think that would turn into anything, but then that became professional writing jobs and stuff like that. So that's kind of how I got into this.
That's very inspiring for me.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly.
I mean, I wouldn't. Yeah,
I was unemployed when I started Marty's Bent. I was
Yeah.
like, I need to stay on top. It's exactly what I
It's
do.
just a good discipline, a good way to like force yourself, whether it's blogging or having a newsletter or a podcast. It's just a good way to like keep yourself like a disciplining mechanism.
It has been, the newsletter in particular has been one of the best.
It's great. It's one,
I've-
you know, like I subscribe to a bunch of newsletters and most of them I don't open, but I always open yours.
Do you?
I'm not just saying that. I really do.
Oh, thank you. I
Yeah,
appreciate
absolutely.
that. When you first shouted me out, I was like, oh my God, Joe Weisenthal.
No, I'm a big
should've
fan.
been-
I'm a big fan.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Try to bring a vulgar voice to the space, the
Yeah,
Barstool
a
voice.
vulgar voice.
Which is
Nice.
actually interesting. So I try to bring a Barstool voice to the space to make it more approachable for people.
Yeah.
And what's funny though, the Barstool story, I found this out when I worked at Barstool earlier this year. The person who built Barstool's first CMS, like Prez Dave, was literally not going to create a blog. He was handing out papers at a
Really?
Boston train station, at Union Station, wherever it is in Boston, like outside every day. It was literally a physical paper. And one person that would pick it up every day moved to New York City and missed it so much and emailed Dave
Oh
and
my
was
God.
like, I miss your paper so much that I'm going to make you a website. Will you please post it here?
That's a great story. I had no idea.
That person happened to be the first CTO of Business Insider.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, that's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So
It's funny, actually. I love that idea of distributing physical paper. I kind of want to do that again because I remember when I first started my blog, it was called thestalwart.com. I co-wrote it with a friend. That's how I have my Twitter name, The Stalwart. I had this idea of like every day I should just hire someone to print up like 500 copies of the day's previous posts and like leave them around the financial district somewhere and by the bank. I never did it, but I wish I had.
it's good viral marketing.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
It's,
But I should have done it. I still kind of like that idea.
Again, Barstool.
You should do that with your newsletter. Just leave it
I'll-
around.
you know what?
Get someone,
You sparked an
hire
idea.
an intern to like go to Kinko's every day and print out 500 and just leave them around.
But I think it's a testament, like this showing up every day, like
Yeah.
what you did with the blog, what Dave did with Barstool. You started your blog, what, over a decade ago? Or
Yeah, a
around
long
decade?
time ago.
Yeah.
I started it in I think 2005.
Yeah, and it's, but like you are extremely successful now. Dave is extremely successful now. I am not on that level by any means, but I do see the value in showing up every day and challenging yourself.
And it's just, it keeps you fresh and it gets your name out there and to some extent. And that, to me, it was when I first got into it. There were two things. I just thought blogs were cool, and they were. But I thought, like, oh, this is a cool new thing that everyone's doing, so I want to be part of that. Kind of like podcasting now or newsletters. Both of which are-
podcasting's hot right now.
Yeah, and then the other thing is I just thought, like, if I don't do something, I'm going to stop paying attention to markets because I will have no real reason to. I wasn't working in finance or anything like that after that job ended. And I wanted to stay fresh, and I wanted to keep being interested. And I was like, so this is a way to do it.
No, it's no, you're an inspiration. And thank you for spreading the good word of the
Thank
band.
you.
It's
Everyone should subscribe to it.
thank you. It's a very humble rag. But let's shift to economics.
Yeah.
Because very interested to talk about this topic with you.
Yeah.
Because I really, again, FinTwit fan.
Thanks.
Love your views on economics, in particularly because I think you do a very good job of seeing all sides or seeing out arguments.
Yeah.
And basically being able to
Well,
put yourself in other people's shoes.
Thanks. I mean, going back to what I was saying about Bitcoin and sort of evolving my view on that a little bit over time, I try to always stress test my ideas and, more importantly, not get too attached to what I believe right now or think that like what I believe right now is necessarily going to believe. I mean, everyone, you probably have gone through this where you like had some worldview at some point in your life and then you look back.
I was a total lib in college.
Right, and then you look back and you're like, oh, I don't really believe that anymore, or I don't find it compelling. And then you're like, well, okay, so if in 2 years you can change your views this much, then how confident can I be that in 2 years I won't change my views again? Like, do I really think that at any point, I've settled on the right answer? It just seems totally implausible to me. So it's not to say like I don't have any like core beliefs or anything. It's more that I don't pretend to think that like I've ever like arrived at some answer. And I think so when it comes to economics, it's kind of obvious to me that nobody really knows what they're talking about too much. And that the
I would argue economics is you're talking to somebody who studied economics. Like that was my major in college. I think it's a pseudoscience. Like I would say.
You know, it's funny. I at first I was gonna say I chafe at that word pseudoscience, but I actually think it's probably a good word for economics because it is not a science, and yet people treat it as such, or the real adherents think to sort of mainstream economics think that lots of things can be boiled down into equations and sort of predictable relationships between inputs and outputs and equilibriums and stuff like that. And it doesn't really seem like the world behaves that way. So maybe pseudoscience is, I kind of think of it as a pejorative, but maybe it's just a very fair characterization of much economics. So.
Yeah, and I mean, that's sort of what disenchanted me. Again, we were talking about this before we started recording, but that's what disenchanted me from finance and then central banking in particular, because I was working at this fund.
Yeah.
So it was 2011 to 2014, so that's 3 years. So it was right in the middle of like the post-crisis, and I was tasked. I was writing our commentaries and running our quarterly calls with our clients, and then we were a fund-to-fund, so we index CTAs, and I had to talk with each CTA CIO, and I had to ask them questions about what's going on in the world, geopolitics, and then central bank policy. And like, so I was a hawk on central bank policy for like 3 years, and it literally got to a point where I was like, you don't know what you're doing. Like I came out of college fresh.
Look, unemployment is at 4%, and we haven't had much inflation, and the stock market is at record highs, and household debt is. See, this is
are you being facetious?
No,
or are you?
No,
are you being dead serious?
Yeah, being dead serious.
What about participation? Let's talk participation rate.
No, there's all kind. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, this is my problem with the sort of I'm anti-Fed kind of, but in a different way than you are.
Okay.
But the economy like still is like real like frailties and problems. But so many of the predictions that these sort of like hawkish monetary types have made, they just haven't been borne out at all. I mean, that's kind of a problem, don't you think?
Well,
that,
we lean on our arch nemesis, John Maynard Keynes, and use his quote: "Markets can remain illogical far longer than you can remain solvent."
Keynes is great. I was just reading him on the subway. I was reading Keynes on the marginal propensity to consume, why people consume, and it's interesting stuff. But Keynes is great. You should reread him.
Don't tell that to Safe Adinamus.
I know, but this is like, I mean, this is my only problem with like.
I studied economics. I've read Keynes. I've read my Keynes. All right,
but this is the main problem I have with like this sort of like gold bug, hawkish, inflation, Austria type is like, it's great in theory. It's just completely wrong in terms of anything that happened. And here's the thing. And I said that like, to your point about economics being a pseudoscience, I don't totally disagree with that. I kind of, upon thinking about it, there's some validity. But like, we live in like the wealthiest society, the U.S. right now, that has ever existed in history.
I would argue that's in spite of the policy.
I mean, it's okay, but then it's really hard to imagine like what is this counterfactual. That's so much, there's been so many different experiments. There was the gold standard for a long time.
For most of human history.
Yeah, and then we abandoned it. Now we're like, the lifestyle, most Americans live a lifestyle that people around the world or in a different era couldn't even conceive of. And if you look at country and, sort of recent examples where countries try to like tie their hands when it comes to monetary policy or fiscal policy, you see a lot of economic basket cases.
That's true. But I would argue that success is confirmation. The success,
I get what you're saying.
Like, there's basing the success off the policy is confirmation bias, and there was beginning in the 20th century, the combustible engine and cars, and then eventually telecoms.
I agree with that. There's a lot that goes into success.
Yes.
And there's a lot. Economic success strikes me as something that is like really hard to replicate. It's kind of like Bitcoin itself in the sense that You just need the right conditions, the right opportunities. It's really hard to just sort of say these are the tools to get success and replicate them. But, if you look around the world, like there's certain aspects of governance, property rights, like basic sort of systems that tend to work better than other places. So, there are countries that have gotten a lot wealthier through our mix of a sort of market economy with significant role for government in setting rules, in welfare, in counter-cyclical policy measures, whether it's fiscal policy or monetary policy. Like the countries that have like generally done that stuff well, like strike me as having gotten wealthier.
I would agree.
And look, like you have to admit, like it's just nothing. But like, okay,
it's within
going back to like the idea that the Fed should have been more hawkish or whatever. I agree. Like
we'll never be able to have another Volcker again. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't.
We will never be able to have another
Why?
Volcker comes in and raises rates to like 8 to 10% and just says, "Hey, this is where it's at." That'll never happen again because
Why? I mean, if we had
because
inflation out of control,
it would destroy our ability to pay back that debt.
well, I don't really believe that that's a problem either because
You are a believer in never being able to roll it over forever.
The
right?
government makes its own money. That's just a fact. I know. No, it's like I know this sounds very simple, but you know that like the government pays back debt in money that it creates, right? Like that's not controversial.
But again, it goes back to the psychology. Like again, and I would argue that not again. I'm sorry, like say again a lot, but I would argue yes, it has worked up to this point, but like any black swan event, it only works until it doesn't.
So this gets to my view about where I see the Austrians being wrong, and to some extent where I see the non-Austrian mainstream being wrong.
All right, let's back up here
shoot.
to preface this because this is on like things to talk about.
This is going to really offend 99% of the
Yes.
listeners, but I can.
If you're not offended, you're not living.
I can handle it.
Even though I don't think Austrian economics is a useful lens for seeing the world economy, and I'm not inclined to doomsday scenarios, I appreciate that Michael B.D. opens this column by admitting that his assessments are mostly a function of his own gloomy personality.
Yeah,
I like that.
So So there's a lot here, but I'll start by saying one thing is that. Okay, this is that a lot of like Austrians and gold types and Bitcoin types are, and I don't. They're not typically they're not interested in being real nice or friendly, and I actually don't mind that per se. So but they're usually people who, for whatever reason, chafe at the mainstream, right?
Yes.
And it's not wrong or inherently bad to not want to be part of the mainstream or not want to get along with people. But a lot of people's worldviews when it comes to economics, I think, starts at personality. Mm-hmm. And so the personality comes first, and then from that comes some set of beliefs. And in many cases, being into gold or whatever is a function of that.
This is getting back to our argument that economics is a pseudoscience. Economics is psychology at the end of the day.
There's some, and I also would say that the sort of like current popular mainstream economics that's sort of promoted by people who work in DC is also probably springs forth from a personality that's like very inclined towards conformism.
Teachers' pets.
In many cases, I think that is a fair characterization. I do think that like often the central banks are going to inflate the currency and we're going to be Venezuela or Weimar and blah, blah, blah. Most of the time, that is not born, I think, from a very rational look at what's actually going on in the economy and largely born from people who are, by their nature, pessimistic or fear of doom. Now, I do think that, and this to sort of broaden it a little bit, and is that if you look at, we're talking about money, the government, well, I'm not worried about the government paying its debts. And I said, the government creates its own money, to which you might say, well, that's just printing money. Look what happens in Venezuela or Zimbabwe or whatever when the government just tries to print money.
Why is Turkey's
Turkey.
Turkey's not Were they printing money?
No, which is a good reason to like be skeptical that there's some connection between quote money printing and inflation.
That's what I was going to say. Like, I don't think they were printing money.
No, they're not. So that should right there like make. But anyway, no, they're not, and they have pretty low government debt as well. But what I think it's actually the other way around, and so it's not that governments get in trouble by printing their money or expanding the currency. It's that really dysfunctional governments cause people to abandon a currency, and then the currency collapses and it loses its value. So it's not the spending or the monetary policy or anything like that. A really great example is Switzerland, which has historically one of the strongest currencies in the world. The Swiss franc
for the longest period of time.
Yeah, and their central bank does things that would horrify like Austrians and hard money types. Like their central bank literally printed up money and bought shares of Apple with it. They instituted a floor for the euro against the franc, by which
we had to stop trading the franc when I was.
Yeah, and so that means they just bought euros. So like they're doing policies that many sort of hard money types would be aghast at and would make their face run pale. And the fact that the Swiss franc through it all has been this incredible store of value, very durable, I just think should really make people rethink some of their assumptions about the connection between currency strength, store of value, and monetary policy. Because there are so many examples of countries doing things that should horrify people, and it doesn't matter. And I think that these examples should be taken more seriously.
Yes.
Is my point.
No, and you're making me think now, Joe. I like this. I'm happy I brought you on.
That's all I want to do, man. I just want to make you think.
No, but... And I would agree. Actually, I've never been able to articulate it that way, but I would agree wholeheartedly. Like, it's all psychology at the end of the day. It's like, again...
It's confident. It's like, if a country, like, runs itself into the ground by, say, being having incredibly corrupt administration, sort of destroying any sort of market functioning, then you're going to get currency collapse and hyperinflation. But it's not the traditional mechanism of expanding or decreasing the money supply. And in fact, if you look at countries that do that and sort of like within a prescribed manner, you don't really see those hyperinflations that people are already worried about. And look, how much did the Fed buy up of government bonds and mortgages? Several trillions. And the cost of a loaf of bread is basically the same as it was 10 years ago. So that should tell you something.
Well, that's another thing. The CPI, yes, the cost of a loaf of bread is the same as 10 years ago. College tuition, healthcare, housing are not.
Yeah, and
they are the most integral parts of our society.
Right. And these are some of the most messed up markets that have nothing to do with monetary policy.
They have to do with government.
Well, yes, but
government should not be subsidizing tuitions. Should not be subsidizing healthcare. I would argue. I think the healthcare system's too far gone. We need to implode it and start new. And this is coming from somebody who, when I was unemployed,
Sure.
I wanted health insurance. I would have loved. I wasn't married to my wife yet, so I couldn't hop on hers. But I literally was unemployed, living paycheck to paycheck, trying not to spend any Bitcoin, and got fined by the government because I didn't have health insurance. It was just like, what the fuck? Kick me while I'm down, like that. And I'm opening up about my personal life here. I hope you guys.
Well, Trump removed the fine, right?
I hope he did. I don't know.
There's no.
I stopped
more
paying
fine.
attention, Joe. I stopped paying attention to politics. See, and I think there's more people becoming apathetic like me.
That's probably true.
Which
I disagree on to some extent on all of those things, everything you just said.
All right,
but if you
let's
look,
go.
but I mean, there's no question. Like, look at like the inability, and there's a lot of liberals and people on the left too who talk about the inability of developers to build new homes in a city. Or to build because of zoning regulations, things like that.
San Fran, get it together. You could be the next Tokyo.
Right. So when you sort of like create these constraints in a market,
these externalities.
There's all kinds of messed up things, I think, with colleges, and I don't know what the best model is for healthcare. But the point that I would say is that none of these things are actually really monetary policy stories.
No.
So again, it's about that link between. You could say, okay, it's the fact that the government subsidizes, although in other countries they also have huge roles for the government and healthcare costs a lot less in other countries. So
Yeah, like
I don't.
Why is that? Like, how could we not? Is it the single payer thing? Like, what is it? Like,
I like I don't know. Like if we could, I'm not a healthcare policy expert, but I do think that we probably have, to some extent in our country, a culture of corruption in healthcare, and that there are so many points on the, whether it's pharmacy benefits managers, so many different people who have figured out how to extract rents from the current system. And
well, so this goes in again. Like, Bitcoinization might happen because people lose faith in the government. Like, things like this are like small things that bubble up. Healthcare in particular, like right now we got an opioid epidemic in this country,
right. And again,
which is enabled by the healthcare industry in particular. Like, the people that are supposed to be healing us are driving opioid addictions.
Whether you can draw a line, I'll say this: whether you can draw a line between all this and the future of Bitcoin, I have no idea. But I will say that there is a lot of stuff that's happened in the last 10 to 20 years that I think has caused a pretty serious crisis of faith in both government and large corporations. And so I think there's one of my favorite books. There's this book, Chain of Title, by this guy, David Dine, who wrote about, it was just about the mortgage crisis. And it was about people who tried to deal with banks to get some sort of adjustment on their mortgage during the downturn. And this is the type of thing that banks want to do because they don't want people to just default and walk away on their mortgage. So if they can do a workout, or they're like, oh, we'll reduce your monthly payment and extend the length of the loan, they're inclined to do that. But the banks and the chain of title, which is where the book came from, the title came from, the book, was so messed up and so disorganized in terms of like who owns this document, who services the loan, who collects the money. It was essentially impossible for the average person in many cases to deal with that gigantic corporate bureaucracy. You would call up your bank and they're like, oh, we don't own your mortgage anymore. Then you call up this and they're like, yeah, we own your mortgage, but we outsource the collection of this company. And then you call up that company and they didn't answer the phone. And so there's all kinds of things, whether it's the financial collapse, whether it's dealing with your healthcare company, which drives people completely insane even when you have good insurance, whether it's dealing with the banks during a time of financial stress, even trying to come to some mutual thing. Modern life is filled with sort of experiencing I think, one sort of large bureaucracy after another, that I do think it has contributed to a disintegration of just sort of general trust and probably increase in alienation. And it is within that environment that I do think something like cryptocurrencies or Bitcoin specifically finds a welcoming home.
I couldn't have said it better. And it just makes sense. And again, this all ties together again with being born in that inflection point. Like, people are just very confused right now. Like, what is up? What is down? Especially, there was a tweet, I think it was that Ed Lattimore guy. Do you follow him on Twitter?
I don't know. I've definitely seen those tweets.
I think he's like an ex-Navy SEAL or something like that, like sending inspirational tweets. But a tweet in particular is like, if you were born between the years of 1983 and 1993, like that 10-year period, like you were literally the bridge between the industrial age and the information age. Like, I remember caller ID becoming a thing and being like, oh my God, I can see that Aunt Lisa's calling me right now. Like, this is crazy. Yeah, that's wild. It's like, what? And now we have like smartphones. Like, I could hop into a virtual reality and talk to you. We could be thousands of miles away having this conversation looking like it's face to face. Like, we have seen, I don't know exactly how old you are, but I would argue that you are in the same bridge.
Yeah. I'm just pre-millennial by like 1 year.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Lucky you.
Yeah. Yeah. I miss being a
You don't get trashed in every other article.
I didn't kill mayonnaise.
What was the last thing the millennials killed or something?
No, it was mayonnaise. That was the thing that everyone was talking about this week.
Was it?
Millennials killed mayonnaise, apparently.
I don't eat mayo anymore.
I love mayonnaise.
I love mayo too.
Yeah, it's all right.
I haven't had it in a while. I haven't had a sandwich. I'm on that no carb, no sugar.
Yeah, I know. So you don't have anything to spread. I don't eat carbs either. I try not to.
looking svelte
you.
right now. You got to for the TV.
Yeah.
Is it true what they say? Does the camera add 10 pounds?
So it's funny because early on when we, after the show launched and we would do, periodic show reviews where we would watch an episode and, sort of critique it and see how it went. And all I could think about is like, oh my God, that double chin. I can't believe I look like that. I look like I'm bursting out of my suit. So it's like, I can't even hear anything that anyone is saying in the show review because I'm just so focused on how I don't like the way I look. So
I'm the same way. I got a New York ID to get a new passport. Very particular story. Got a New York ID, but I needed to renew my license, which is in Pennsylvania, where I'm from. I was going to be okay with losing my license, like don't need to drive. But the New York ID was so ugly. I had like a double chin, looked so bad in it. I was like, I'm going to PA. I'm getting a new license, and it was bad. And luckily, I've got a body type for podcasting, so this is perfect that we're behind the mics.
I do too, but I never expected to be on air. So I also have a face and a body type for podcasting, but they stuck a camera in front of me, so I have to at least put in the effort.
Well, yeah, let's jump in. What was that like? Like becoming a TV media host? Like
it's really fun. It's the best. It's not something I ever aspired to do when I was sort of blogging and then writing more professionally. I've been Business Insider. I never thought, I want to one day be on TV. I had gone on TV as a guest a few times from here and there. I didn't love it. Mm-hmm. It felt like it was short conversations that weren't nice and in depth like this conversation. But then, so Bloomberg came to me with the opportunity to co-host a show there, and also do some editing and writing. And I said to myself, well, even though I've never really aspired to do TV, how many people ever get a chance to say, I co-hosted a TV show? So even if it totally flames out and I'm terrible at it, I'll always be able to say, I hosted a show on cable for a little while. And when I thought about it that I was like, okay, I can't really say no to this opportunity. But I love it. And I like it way more than I expected. I really like the co-hosts that I've had. My colleague Scarlett, she is the coolest, most professional person that I've ever worked with. Makes me feel incredibly comfortable. And then I'm on TV for an hour and a half each day. And every day I get to talk to smart people on camera about stuff that I like. So every day I talk to people about economics and markets and politics. And that's pretty great. And if you just think about it like that, having a conversation with someone you respect about something you're interested in, and then there happens to be a camera there, it's a pretty cool job.
Is it?
And I genuinely enjoy it.
Was there an adjustment to the camera or anything?
Absolutely. So I was never really nervous, but it's one of those things where there are certain technical aspects to it that you just have to become comfortable with, knowing what camera is on, or the ability to talk. It was really hard for me in the beginning to talk to someone. I have an earpiece in my ear and someone says, okay, just 30 seconds, or don't forget to ask about this. And that would really jar me on air. I'm like, what? But you just get better at it. It's just like anything else. Nobody is, except the truly gifted, are really going to be that good at it the first handful of times. But that was also another aspect of it that appealed to me, which was just, it'll be fun to be bad at something and to try to get good at it. And so that's also been a fun aspect of it.
That's something that my mother taught me is baptism by fire is the best way.
Yeah, it's great.
And
it's in.
You do a great job.
Thanks. I don't know that I would actually. I appreciate you saying that. I don't know that I would actually say that I'm good at TV. I'm definitely better than I used to be, but I like the process of learning something new.
I think you're very good. That's why I was actually nervous, prepping for this interview and having you, interviewing an interviewer is something very daunting for a lowly podcast like Tales from the Crypt.
Thank you.
So I appreciate you coming in, but this is a good segue to the next topic we want to talk about, which is mainstream media coverage of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in particular. I will say this hands down. Again, I'm not trying to blow smoke up your ass, but you are the best journalist in the mainstream that's covering the sector.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yes.
Obviously, I have a few thoughts. So obviously, mainstream media has come under tons of criticism. Literally, anytime you say anything about Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, you're just going to be in for like tons of abuse. But hopefully, most journalists are used to getting abused, so it sort of comes with the territory. But there is a lot, and people are like, oh, you don't get this, you don't get that, whatever. I think there's a few things. I mean, it's still really new. So it's hard. New things are hard to wrap your head around. I still have a hard time wrapping my head around it. There's a natural inclination to try to fit it into, particularly from a market standpoint, fit it into an existing asset class bucket. And I don't think maybe another episode one day, it's a whole separate discussion of like what is Bitcoin from a financial perspective, like what kind of asset class it is. I
could make this 2 episodes if you want to.
Yeah, it could be a whole other episode. I have thoughts, but that's for another time. But it doesn't fit neatly into anything. It's kind of like a currency, but currencies typically don't go up like 10,000% in a year. It's kind of like a commodity with the mining process, but it's not really used for anything. So it's.
Before you go any further, would you see this as a use case? So we're talking about China and Bitcoin in particular. At one point, somebody embedded information about the Tiananmen Square massacre into a Bitcoin block. So anybody in China could access that where it's completely blacklisted. Is that a use case?
I think it could be. The idea of the Bitcoin blockchain as a repository of information strikes me as a plausible thing at some point in the future.
Yeah.
So yes, and that's I haven't explored that much, but that does seem plausible-ish. The other idea that non-monetary information and that the network secures that strikes me as interesting.
Yes, interesting, and it's a very, very narrow niche use case where it's like information in a block, and you can only fit so much information in where it's
interesting. But it's not really doesn't really behave like a commodity. I also think there's it has some equity-like characteristic. Anyway, people think we have these asset classes that have existed forever: stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities, and it's really hard to wrap your head around something totally new. And there's no real. We're used to quoting experts in this field, but there's a lot of people who are expert-ish but turn out to be charlatans or just have something to sell you or whatever it is. So there's no like real experts because let's be honest, even the experts are trying to figure it out themselves.
Yeah, the experts I speak to, the developers, Matt Corral gives it like a 5% chance of success. So
right.
That's like an expert for you.
Right. And then I think obviously the media likes things that are going up and down a lot in price, and that's very exciting. And so whether it's altcoins or Ethereum, whatever, it's just like a compelling story. But I also get why that drives people crazy. But on the other hand, like there's real money, especially in this space, even outside of Bitcoin. So like you have to like talk about that stuff. So I get why people are frustrated in many cases, but I think the media's continues to get a lot better by and large, and that there's a lot of good at a lot of different places. I'm proud of our coverage of Bloomberg, but at a lot of places I think there's the quality of coverage has gotten better and better, and it just keeps getting better. But I understand, like, of course it was pretty bad in the beginning because who knew what it was?
Exactly. I'm going to give a little flack to the @crypto account right now. They made a vast mistake with the Coinbase data earlier today with the 50,000 signups a day or whatever.
No comment, but
No, and that's the other thing.
Errors happen.
No, and speaking as somebody, I always hate to consider myself media, but obviously I'm media. I'm speaking via audio and written media every day. But it took me 4 years to build up the courage to even tweet about this,
right? Let
alone like write long form about it. I can't imagine like the daunting task of being in a newsroom and like, hey, Bitcoin's your new what's the word I'm looking for? Beat.
Yeah, it's really hard, and there's a really steep learning curve. And I think that the good coverage at various outlets has really been about like Well, last year and still is just a golden age for scams.
Yes.
And there's so many people in crypto who are just trying to rip people off and sell magic beans or whatever. And I think we've done a lot of good coverage, as of others, of just like all the bad stuff out there.
Yeah. And again, I want to repeat that I think you in particular, as a journalist, are doing the best job out there. And I hate to I always say, like, don't ever like label me or anything, but Bloomberg is a mainstream media company,
that's
obviously.
fair characterization.
And it's interesting, like being, I don't know, like, am I indie, whatever you might call it?
Yeah, independent media.
And having like, I have strong views, but sometimes I see people writing, like, they have these platforms. I'm like, oh my God, like, let me like reach out to you and like help you out here. But it's like,
well, you should do that.
But it's like, yeah, I'm shy. I'm shy, believe it or not. I'm shy. I'm very, I'm selectively introverted, and I never want to impose my views on other people, which I'm doing every day, actually. But
well, I'll say this, Bitcoin or crypto aside, people journalists are just normal people who want to learn more about
are
stuff.
they?
Yeah.
What? I thought they were aliens.
No, it's like people. I mean, it's gotten really crazy with politics.
Exactly.
Lately.
So let's jump into this. Like,
yeah.
it's crazy environment right now.
But people have imaginations of like what they think are like, oh, journalists have an agenda, or like if I say something negative about Bitcoin or something like that, they're like, oh, Bloomberg is in the pocket of the big banks, and of course it's like, you have no idea how it works.
It's not how it works.
It's not how. No one has ever come to me and said like, oh, we have a lot of clients who are big banks, so you have to write about this. Like, it's just that fantasy that people have that there's like some agenda or some advertiser agenda, and that everyone has these like marching orders, is just could not be more wrong.
Well, and I completely agree, because that's applied to like every industry.
Every
industry.
Yeah,
like when I worked at a hedge fund, people were like, "Yeah, you're a scumbag," but like,
yeah.
I was like, no, number one, I'm not. Like, this doesn't matter
of course
whether
it's not me.
It's not me. Like, I'm not the one collecting money, but like the CEO of the firm I work for, Dave Cavanaugh, shout out Dave Cavanaugh in Chicago, was the nicest, most wholesome person I've ever met in my life, and he would never try to like rip anybody off for a dime. And
yeah, I do think that people just have this idea that like, or even Bitcoin aside, like, or the Federal Reserve, like people just have this imagination that like journalists have these like ideological marching orders, and that all stories have to back them up. And most journalists are like pretty open-minded and want to learn about stuff, and no one is like telling them to advance some agenda. So
yeah,
it's not nearly as exciting as it is.
This is a conspiracy theorist make it up.
Exactly.
What a world we live in. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
That's a good question. It's funny, like I'm a intellectual like optimist, and like, but I also have like this like pessimism in my gut, and I've always had this my whole life. Like I was worried about like Y2K, but then I think like I really was. I was I honestly remember 1999 being actually anxious. Like, is the whole like electronic system going to go down? Of course it didn't, but I can use that example because that sounds funny now. Like, oh, I was nervous about Y2K, and that turned out to be a complete nothing. But I was probably more nervous than most people. But then I can go back and say, okay, well, like this is my personality. Like I get nervous about stuff. I get anxious. So I like sort of like temper that intellectually with like a knowledge that I sort of like am tilt towards anxiousness. So I try to keep it in balance. But it's I wouldn't say it's like pessimism. But going back to what we were talking about earlier with the internet, like we do live in weird times. And it would be kind of weird if in, say, 10 or 20 years, society looked anything like it did 10 or 20 years earlier, or politics, just because we were going through such intense change. So much of it driven by, I think, communication and new media, that there's, I don't know whether it's pessimism, but I guess I'd be pessimistic that things will be particularly stable.
Yes.
Which maybe could be good. I mean, it could be like a instability that leads to something great. I don't know. But
well, that's what I wrote about yesterday in the newsletter. Tour de Meester, shout out Tour, probably one of the most level-headed analysts in the space, Adamant Research. But he reposted a letter he shared with his investors 3 years ago, talking about building stuff in these types of societal changes. So the last one was the Industrial Revolution with the combustible engine with cars.
Yeah.
You had companies like Ford, Porsche, Volkswagen being built at the depths of the Depression, like literally the worst parts of the Depression. And he thinks something similar is going to happen around this juncture of history, is where potentially, I mean, we're seeing it happen, like where you have sovereign debt crises and stuff like that, and potential to go into a global recession. You will see things emerge from this desperate state.
I mean, there's no question. Like, if you look at a lot of what was built, especially in tech, like is very different today than it was pre-crisis, pre-financial crisis. And I just think that the sort of anti-hierarchical nature of a lot of modern communication technology is just a big deal. And that to some extent, societies and countries are defined by the media. And we don't even really know like what a society that's sort of built on social media looks like. Because everything prior to it was like structurally similar to the state. In other words, it's very top down. You get your orders, you get your news top down, and then it's sort of like the structure of media kind of resembled the structure of politics. And now we have a situation in which the structure of politics is very different from the structure of media.
That's why Trump won. I would argue.
I think the change of media is a big aspect of it. And this is going to create just more and more tensions, I think.
And it's fascinating, man. It really is. Like, and that's like the only thing I say. It's like fascinating to be alive during this time and watch it happen. Is
it is fascinating.
Who has control anymore? And that's like what I worry about. Like, I would argue that I'm an optimist, but I worry about like true anarchism. Like what Bitcoin sign guy came on, the guy that held up the buy Bitcoin sign behind Janet Yellen. He de-alienated between an anarchist and an anarch, which is very, very, was a very new thought for me. Where like
what's an anarch?
So an anarchist is somebody who's somewhat nihilistic in their views.
Oh, I see.
They just want anarchy, for like, they don't want any structure at all. But an anarch is somebody who wants anarchy for, and I could be butchering this. I have to go back and re-listen. But like an anarch is somebody who wants anarchy for ideological reasons. Like this is actually a better way of, with the technology that we've been giving, of organizing our society. And they proactively, like the Sovereign Individual would be a book written by a couple of anarchs who are like, hey, the world is trending towards this direction, and if we are going to go into anarchy, we should be true anarchs where we try to help everybody out by giving them access to this information and teaching them about these technologies.
Got it. I see what you're saying.
Whereas an anarchist would just be like, fuck everything. Like,
right. That's an interesting distinction.
Yeah. And that's something I've been thinking about more recently. Where it's and then at the same time, like, you're talking to somebody, so I think I have a very unique, I would love to hear this. You're almost a decade older than me. How old are you?
I'll be 38 in like 2 weeks.
That was very rude of me to ask, but you're exactly.
It's fine, I'm not offended.
You're exactly a decade older than me.
Right.
I'm 27. I'll be 28 in 9 months. And I love how we put our wedding fingers on our thumbs.
I'm playing with my ring.
We're playing with our wedding rings.
I fiddle with my ring because I don't want to. Well, I actually need to get it resized because I lost a little weight, and so it's
I'm
like
the same way. I went surfing the other week.
So I actually now it like slips off my finger a lot.
Yeah, I went surfing the other week. It fell out. I had to like dive to the bottom of the ocean.
And you found it?
Yeah. I found it.
You know what's funny? I lost my wedding ring like about a month after I got married because it also fell to the bottom of the ocean, but I also found it. It was in shallow, clear water. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But going back to what I was saying, what the hell was I saying?
Something about how you're 27?
Yeah, so I'm 27. And yes, so I think so the financial crisis in particular to me, like I was a senior in high school in the fall of 2008. I graduated high school in the spring of 2009. But in the fall of 2008, I just so happened to be taking an economics elective while Lehman Brothers was failing, while
Yeah.
everything was failing, which set me on a journey through college to learn more. Like, so I went to a college with a know your enemy type mentality of like, how the fuck could it get this bad? So I went to go study economics, learn about money and stuff like that. And so that's the mentality I have, like being in that situation at that certain time and having like those emotions inflicted on me.
Yeah.
And following that in particular. Like, am I biased because of that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if like I would call that as bias. Like we're all like products of our
Environment.
in the unique moment. You know, something that I think a lot about with regards to economics is how many people who are in power right now had their formative years in the early 80s when inflation was the biggest danger, and the degree to which that guides people's assessments of the risks. And so I think, you know, even for years after the crisis, it kind of seemed pretty obvious to me that like unemployment was still too high and that inflation was just not a thing that was happening. We always say it's like, oh, if the Fed, we got to raise rates, inflation's going to take off. And I kind of understand that from the perspective of like, if the most important years of your life
We're during the oil crisis.
were during like surging inflation, in which your cohort was part of the people that like beat inflation and stuff like that, then that's always going to be what you fear. And so I think like, again, thinking back the last 10 and 20 years, the financial crisis and the Iraq war, I think two things that just created extraordinary amount of disillusionment, both with business, with the banking system, and with the government. And that we are going to be living with the sort of scar tissue of that disillusionment, I think, for a very long time.
Yes. I mean, I think I'm a product of that. I am a product of that scar tissue.
Yeah.
And for me in particular, I was 17 years old. Like, I was I'm a young student. I was I was always one of the youngest in my grade, but like at 17 years old, the fall of 2008, we went through the TARP bill, and I was a 17-year-old. Like, these politicians in Arkansas, like, to pass this TARP bill, like an arrow has to be sharpened in a certain way. Like, they had so many they had so many clauses in it where it wasn't really about like saving the financial.
It's one of those things like where you don't want to see how the sausage is made.
Exactly. And it was like at 17, I was like, what the fuck is going on here? And I think that's really what's driven my ideology since then. And,
yeah. Well, I think, I mean, you know, it's funny. It's for as bad as it is here, I always think about like in Europe, and where you've had youth unemployment at times in the 40%, 25, 30%. Like what that does to an entire generation, that people in their formative years, out of college, for maybe a decade, saw elevated unemployment. It's just extraordinarily depressing to think about the long-term consequences that will have. And this is why, you know, in favor of counter-cyclical policy, one of the arguments that people make for like reducing government debt and spending is they'll say, oh, like think of the burden of the next generation that has to pay it back. I say, think of what it does to the next generation if they grow up in a time of no jobs, poor education and healthcare prospects. So I think you could cut it both ways.
It's fascinating though. It's crazy how intricate we are as humans. Like, anything can change our psychology, and I'm not trying to pontificate on humanity or anything, but it's like something I'm still trying to grasp. Like, I would argue, like you said, like you change your political economics views. Like, I don't know if I have like set views on everything yet. Like, I'm still.
It'd be weird if you did. And you know, another thing, and this gets back to my views on like money and what is money. It's like all of the interesting questions in life are impossible to answer, and so it's like saying like what is money is like kind of saying like what is love. And if no one has an answer for that, we know that nobody has an answer for that because people keep writing songs and doing poems and paintings that try to like capture that. Which, like, if there was a clear answer, you wouldn't have to write a poem about it. You're just like, oh, what's love? Well, here it is. But it's clear that. So it's like, what's money? Like, we can kind of like approach an answer. It's like store of value, medium of exchange, whatever. But it's like we know we're never really going to settle on the answer because no one ever really has. But you just hope that sort of like over time we like iterate to a view that we like kind of see the outlines of it. And I think all these questions about like sort of the nature of humans and the nature of humans interacting with new technology and media, it's like, are we going to come up with some answer or some worldview that's right? No, but if we're lucky, maybe eventually if we like squint, we like kind of see the outline of the answer. And that's sort of like my thinking on all this stuff.
Deep. Joe goes deep. No, and I would completely agree. And I'm happy that I'm alive right now.
Yeah,
I'm very
me
happy
too.
that I am.
Absolutely, me likewise.
In this particular time,
100%.
I'm happy I did not have to grow up through the 70s and 80s like my parents.
Yeah, and that's right. Like every generation seems to have their sort of like existential angst and like their thing that they're scared as hell about. Mm-hmm. And you think about like, you know, the awful things, the awful periods of discrimination and codified racism that we've had in this country. You think about fear of nuclear annihilation. You think about being drafted and being forced into a war. Like, there's no generation that just sort of is like, oh yeah, it was really good. They just had it easy. Like, there's always going to be something. So obviously, I think right now we live in a time of incredible change, and it's not obvious that it's going to end or that it will lead us to some place that's much better. Maybe it will. Regardless, there's always something.
Exactly. And that's, you get lost in the sauce like while you're living
yeah,
through
so you just gotta
you
gotta
like,
step away and sort of look at,
put it in context.
Yeah,
that's one thing we talk about on this podcast. We're getting deep into this conversation. I think almost an hour and 45 in.
Wow.
I think we can spend the last 15 minutes of this talking about your relationship with Comfortably Smug on Twitter. By the way, for you freaks that don't know, Comfortably Smug is some anon Twitter account, and
you know his name is out there.
I don't know.
Oh.
Yeah, he was like a hedge fund or something like that. It's out there. You can find an article on it.
Yeah.
We're not going to dox him right now, but
right.
Joe wasn't expecting this at all. But my favorite interactions on Twitter throughout the years have been you and Comfortably Smug.
We have the same birthday.
Do you really?
Yeah, we were both born September 2nd.
This makes a lot of sense.
So we're sort of like Twitter brothers, Twitter twins, and we have the same birthday.
Have you ever met him in real life?
I have.
Okay.
And in fact, there's actually, for people who want to sleuth and Google it, that's been written about.
Has it?
Yeah.
Again, like, I've never met Comfortably Smug. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just want you to know it's my favorite ongoing Twitter interaction of all time.
Thank you.
It's hilarious.
He's a funny guy.
He is. Is he funny? Is he funny in real life?
Yeah. He's a funny guy.
Yeah. All right. Do you have any questions for me?
Well, I am like curious. Like, how did you get into? How did Bitcoin become a thing for you? Why did you get into it?
Yeah, like I was saying, like I was studying. I think it was when I was a senior in high school.
Actually, let me rephrase the question. When you first heard about it, because like when I first heard about Bitcoin, I was like, "This is dumb," but you didn't have that. Like, what about it said like, "Oh, this makes sense to you"?
So, I was in Chicago. It was 2012, 2013. I forget exactly which year it was, but I was studying economics at DePaul University. And I just so happened to be taking a course on monetary policy, like specifically monetary policy and how it works, and was writing a paper on monetary policy, and
Sure.
literally Googled like the Googling stuff and stumbled upon Bitcoin. I was like, oh, this is interesting. So that was like my first brush with it. It was like this is like a potential sound monetary policy. I think like 6 months later, the Silk Road started blowing up and stuff like that. I was still in college. And then I think I'd started interning at this futures fund where I was getting more in depth with central bank announcements and having to follow that stuff, and decided to like dive like fully in like my senior year of college. And I just, again, I think it's because of the rebel nature of, number one, me being from Philadelphia in general, where being from Philly, like you're naturally contrarian, I would believe, or naturally confrontational. And then having that experience as senior year of high school, being like, this is like, I just had like an innate feeling and like that, when I was taking that class and while the while Lehman Brothers was failing, when all
Yeah.
that was going on, I was like, this just like isn't right. Like,
Yeah.
there has to be some other type of system. And I wasn't actively looking, but was like open to, hey, there probably is something better out there. And I found Bitcoin and was like, I think this might be better. And that's why I went down to it.
I do think that, again, it's interesting that there were the group of people, the cypherpunks, who were trying to create, for years prior to Bitcoin, some sort of digital cash.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to this sort of, when was the white paper? 2008 was the white paper?
Halloween 2008.
Halloween 2008.
Yeah.
And so it's like, in addition to like all of the, there are so many good aspects of like the Bitcoin mythology, like the fact that no one has ever been able to figure out who Satoshi Nakamoto was, the white paper. I think it's interesting that Satoshi's wallet, like he's never spent from it, he or she. We really don't know.
There's a theory on that. I'll let you finish and I'll tell you the theory.
That's never been spent. And so it's like, in a way, it's like this person arrived on Earth, created this thing, didn't even like want to like get rich on it themselves, and then disappeared. But also the fact that it happened at a point when, again, society was receptive to it. And like if it had come in like 96, when everyone was getting rich, it seemed like, and the internet was booming and stuff like that, and we hadn't gone through like all kinds of crises, who knows? But it came, it's like the solution arrived because it was, people had been trying to solve the problem of digital cash for so long. The solution arrived on Earth, like at just the right moment. And I think what you're describing with like your receptiveness to it is exactly right. Like everything is falling apart, and here is this new thing that kind of made sense.
Exactly. And I mean, Satoshi, whoever he, she, it, they are, like obviously knew that, like
Right.
like embedding the Times of London
Yeah.
headline into the Genesis block.
Right.
It's
Like
an overt statement, like,
Yeah.
hey, this is
this is a response to a
this.
very bad system.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that resonates with people. It resonates with me still to this
Yeah.
day. And it's crazy to think, like, and like you were saying, like, you can't believe it's been 10 years since like Business Insider and like coming to Bloomberg and starting a blog and stuff like that. I can't believe I've been in this space like almost 10 years now.
Yeah,
like,
it's wild.
It's not almost 10 years, like 7 years, but
Yeah.
or 6 years, excuse me. But it's been like it's been a quarter of my life now.
Right.
Like when you think about it, like at that level, I'm like, oh shit, man, am I crazy? Like, am I like a crazy gold bug? Like, I do not want to turn into the crazy gold bug. That is something that I'm very conscious of and want to avoid in the long run. I just want to be some dude that's able to save his money throughout time. And
Yeah. You know, the saving your money throughout time question, something is its own interesting question, because it is a form of time travel. Because what you're essentially, the idea of like saving wealth or saving any money from like point A to point B, is like you have X amount of purchasing power today, right? With the money you have in your bank account, and you would like to be able to have that same amount of purchasing power at some point in the future, maybe more. But it's not a trivial question how to do that. And you're sort of asking society, if you want to do that, to say like, hey, remember I had all this money at time point A. Can you make sure that you let me have the same amount of... But it's like, no one's under any obligation to respect that per se. And so people have always tried to solve that problem. But something I think about a lot is like, think of how big the wealth management industry is. It's one of the biggest, most profitable industries in the world. If saving money over time was an easy task, that would not be a very big industry, because...
Well, they don't have the tools of sound money that Bitcoin provides, you know?
Yeah, well, I think Bitcoin has a long way to go to demonstrate that your purchasing power at time A will be anything like, or at time B will be anything like what it was at time A. We have, I would say that is not proven.
But again, you're talking to somebody who came from the wealth management industry, and like we were working with high net worth individuals and preserving wealth, but I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus,
Sure.
but the hedge fund and the mutual fund and the whole BDRIA like landscape, it's a fee game at the end of the day. Like I would argue, like they
sure, and
there's
absolutely,
little,
and I agree, but I think that people are willing to pay the fee because the central question of how to preserve wealth over time is much harder than it looks. And I don't mean like beating the market or anything like that. That's maybe, who knows if anyone can really do that consistently. I just mean that like society is under no obligation to guarantee anyone that they can hold on to their wealth. Like you could like buy land and hopefully the property, that's something, buy gold, but then you have to like pay someone to store it. That's risk having it stolen. Like there's things you can do, but you got to pay up for it. And so the deal is like you can kind of time travel with your money, but no one does it for you. Don't get it. There's no free ride on it. Somehow you're going to pay. You could, let's just say, even if you were to stipulate that Bitcoin eventually became a stable store of value, you're then going to take pretty significant risks of like losing access to all of it, which that's happened to numerous people. Mm-hmm. So the costs are going to be somewhere.
Yeah.
Now, you may like that may not be an issue eventually, but the point is like it is not a trivial question to preserve wealth over time.
But what if it became trivial? Like it was just that's why I like Bitcoin. It's dumb, it's slow, it does one thing. What if you could depend on something like that and you knew it was not going to be bastardized in the long run? Like how does that change society? And we're like almost 2 hours in. Like we could dive into like another 45-minute conversation on this in particular. Are you okay with like a Joe Rogan 3-hour podcast?
I think I think my brain is getting. I don't think I'm quite ready to talk about how this is going to change society.
You're not even drinking.
I know, but I'm not eating very much either.
That's true. I need to eat.
Yeah. So I feel like the odds of me saying something stupid are starting to accelerate rapidly every second.
Well, that's the last thing I want to do is make you look stupid.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm not some gotcha journalist.
I know. I appreciate
indie media guy. I'm genuinely curious to see what people think. Like, that's what I consider myself dumb. Like, I'm like, I
think like, just on this question of like store of value, I think it's one of the most interesting questions.
Right.
And we were talking about it earlier, like different types of assets store value against different types of scenarios. So some is about collapse of fiat currency, maybe some would be personal safety, like having land, whatever.
Well, people always ask, like, if we go into a recession or a depression, is Bitcoin an asset to hold? I'm like, no, because people are going to sell their Bitcoin for cash,
right?
Because that's what's going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say like you always sell into the currency that you have to pay your bills in.
Exactly.
So it's like your landlord wants cash. And so if you don't have a job, then you have to start selling things for cash.
Exactly.
And, over time, certain assets could become more durable, less risky than others. But there's always risks. And so it's like with land, which might be a good store of value, like worry about flooding. You could, there's all kinds of you face natural disaster risk, whatever it is.
You're on Yosemite, it could blow up any day.
Yeah, so I don't think we're ever going to solve the problem of a guaranteed stable store of value that you can just set it and forget it and feel confident that it will hold its purchasing power from A to time B to time C. The risk has to be somewhere. It's just different.
And we're going to get cosmic here. Maybe that's something built into our DNA that forces us to always innovate and think from our feet. Like the complacency of having that type of store of value might make it so that we don't innovate to an extent. You get it.
There might be
rest on
something
your
to that,
laurels.
yeah.
Just interesting. Joe, we're close to 2 hours. It's been an incredible conversation. Honestly,
I've really enjoyed it.
It's been.
It's a great discussion. You're a really good interviewer. So you claim to be anxious about interviewing an interviewer, but you are very skilled at it. So thank you. I thought this was a really enjoyable conversation, and I am very excited. It's funny. Like I like that. I've enjoyed coming on your podcast.
Thank you, Joe. It's humbling for me in particular. Like, again, been a fan for years.
Thank you.
One thing on this podcast, we do a final note, a parting word for the freaks out there. What would it be in regards to anything? Bitcoin, career-wise, media, whatever it might be. A final thought, if you will. Could be completely random.
A final thought on anything. What am I thinking about these days? Read Keynes, man. He's great. I know no one's gonna like that, but
nobody's gonna like that.
Open your mind.
I'm not. All right. I'll tell you what I want to say after we finish recording.
After we stop recording, you're going to tell me what you didn't want to put on record. That's my final thought. But that's what I'm into right now.
And that's a good final thought. To find out more about Joe, I'm sure most of you are already following him on Twitter at the Stalwart. Every day at 5 p.m.
3:30 to 5 is my show.
3:30 to 5. 3:30 to 5.
Yeah.
What did you miss? Bloomberg TV. He's got Robert Keane coming on all the time.
Yeah, check it out.
He's a Don. Always wearing a bow tie. Big bow tie
Tom
guy.
Keane. Yeah,
Tom Keane. Tom Keane, not Robert.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
He's my idol.
He's
one of them.
He's a consummate professional, I would argue. Freaks, thanks for tuning in. Peace and love.